Welcome to the Inconvenient Minority Podcast. I'm your host, Kenny Shu. Joining me today is Delano Squires. Delano is a homeschool dad, a former contributor at The Root, and a proud member of the Black and married community. He's posted many important things and commentary on his Twitter, where you can follow him, and he also contributes to The Federalist. Delano, it's great to see you.
Kenny, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely, Delano. So, I talked with you a little bit before, and you were talking about you growing up in Benjamin Cardona School in Queens, engineering. You're Black and married with kids. Now you live in the DC area, and I think you have a lot to say. I think about Black culture, the family, and the things that are most important to you. So, first of all, where did you meet your wife, or how did you meet her?
It's a great question. So you mentioned Black and married with kids, and I used to write for them probably starting in about 2010. And at the time, I was single. I was the only single writer for the site, and the site was started to provide resources and more positive images of Black couples, parents, marriages, and families. So I was writing for them, and they had a movie premiere, a documentary screening in DC. This was their third documentary. It's called Men Ain't Boys, and it was the Avalon Theater. And the couple that started it said, "Hey, we're gonna be back in the area. We'll leave a ticket for you if you want to come." And I didn't intend to go because I had class at night. I was in grad school, and then I also
For engineering?
no for public policy. Yeah, I was at George Washington. So, and then the NCAA tournament was on, and my team was playing, UConn Huskies. But I said, you know what? I'm gonna go support the couple, Lamar and Ronnie Tyler. They always supported me. They gave me a chance to write for the site, so I went, and I happened to sit on a row with a couple of young ladies, and I started talking to one of them, and we exchanged numbers, and we went on our first date probably, a couple weeks after that. And a couple months after that, we were engaged, and then we got married the next year.
Wow, a couple months after you started
Yeah,
dating.
we met March 24th, 2011. We went out for the first time around early April. We started dating seriously around June, July. We got engaged in December, and then we got married the next July.
And where is she from? What part of the country?
She's from Texas. She's from Houston.
From
Yeah,
Texas.
yeah. So it was
Wow.
cool. Yeah, I didn't know her outside of that meeting, so it's not like we were in the same circle. So that's why it's I owe a lot to Lamar and Ronnie Tyler and Black and Married with Kids, because not only did they give me my first shot writing for for public consumption, but their documentary um, allowed me to meet my future wife. So I got a lot of love for the Tylers.
Wow. It's amazing. Well, it's both like it is both an incredible positive, first of all, that you met your wife at a Black and Married with Kids event, and also a signifying factor why such an organization like Black and Married with Kids, needs to happen or has happened. I just give you a couple statistics here. 32% of Black men and 26% of Black women are currently married. And that is in relation to the rest of the United States. That's 48% among all races are married. So significantly fewer Black people, both in the male side and on the female side, are married. And why do you think that is?
I think it's a complex set of factors. I mean, if you look at the data, marriage is down across the board in the United States. More kids, and when I talk about marriage, I tend to think about these two things combined, right? So one is, the marriage rates. We can break it down by groups or by income level or class level, but one is the marriage rate, and then the other is um, the non-marital birth rate. So what people would have called out of wedlock births, right? I think those two things tell a story about the state of the American family. And across the board, both of those, the first one is down and the other one is up. Um, I think specifically for the Black community, it's a couple of things. Again, broader shifts in American culture around sex, marriage, child rearing, you know, starting with the, sexual revolution and, sort of moving from the 60s into the 70s, 80s. I think that's one factor. People will say that, you know, deindustrialization in the Midwest and changes in sort of economic opportunities for Black men is a factor. Could be. I don't dismiss that. Um, I think another big one was a change in public policy in the 60s. Up until the mid 60s, the majority of Black children were being raised in two-parent households. So at the time, are you familiar with the Moynihan report? I'm sure you've heard of it before.
Yeah, I
So
am.
at the time that report was created, um,
Well, actually, why don't you explain to our viewers a
sure,
little bit about
sure,
what
sure,
the
sure, sure.
Moynihan report?
So the Moynihan report was a report created by Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and he was a politician, a sociologist, a Democrat, and I believe he was a senator. Yeah, I believe he was a senator. And the report was called it was on the state of the Black family, and he talked about a number of things, but the biggest takeaway is that it it pointed to the increase in the rate of non-marital births in the Black community, and at that time it was about 25%, and that was seen as cause for action. And the report um, argued that the this increase was not caused by lack of jobs, but by certain changes in culture. Um, and I think he might have tied it to, you know, slavery and Jim Crow and other sort of structural factors. But regardless of what he tied it to, I think the conclusion of the report is if this trend continues, it's going to have larger effects, for the Black family. So that was in 1965, and as again at that time it was about 1 in 4 Black children were born to unmarried parents. By the time you get into the mid 80s, that number was about 50%, and it's been steadily at about 70% probably since the 90s or the 2000s. Um, so so I said all that to say, um, in the 60s there were a series of you know um, policy decisions. The one that comes to mind particularly is the changes to welfare um, under some of the I want to say it's the Great Society programs from Lyndon Johnson, and um, those changes made it one. They opened the welfare rolls, and um, more Black women who previously under the welfare system may have been excluded, typically because of some of the jobs that they did. All right, so if you were a domestic, you may not be included. I don't think they were included in some of the older, um, I guess, enrollment criteria. But long story short, the the government made a decision to make it possible for men to not have to financially support their children, and for women who have children to be able to depend on government support instead of in previous generations it would have been either that man and woman would have been married, or I'm sure you've heard the term shotgun marriages, where the couple gets pregnant, they're not married, and then they get married in order to raise their kids together. So I think some of those policies certainly help contribute to the change. A lot of times you'll hear people say, "Oh, this is because of slavery and segregation." But as I said, even into the '60s, the majority of black kids were raised by married parents. And coming out of slavery, in the '20s, the the rates of marriage for blacks and whites were about the same. But again, since the '60s, you've seen that divergence, and at least in my estimation, one generation of bad government policy did what hundreds of years of slavery and segregation could not do. Um, and then the last piece is, and I mentioned culture. I started with culture in terms of different norms and values around kids, children, and marriage. But then the other thing is that once a new cultural norms get set in, the things that cause them, whether it's policy or economics, those things don't have to continue, right? It's like a snowball. You give it its initial momentum, it gathers steam, the snowball gets bigger. You don't have to keep pushing it all the way down the mountain. So by the time you get into the '90s, where um, it is not abnormal to see, unmarried couples having kids, and sometimes by multiple people, what they call multiple partner fertility. Um,
Yeah.
I think after a while, those things set in, and it's not abnormal at all. But again, you see some of these changes in broader society, and even among working class whites. Um, that the percentage of kids born to unmarried parents recently, within the last 10 years, crossed over the 50, you know, crossed over the 50% mark. So what you end up seeing, if you look at what you see when you look at the data, is that marriage is becoming a luxury good. So the college educated, the upper income are still marrying at similar rates as they used to, but for working class and lower income Americans, it's in many neighborhoods and many communities, it's all but disappeared. And
So you bring up a lot of things, and I'm interested in basically everything that you have to say on this. But let's start with um, let's start with uh, a common critique of the state of the black family and black men, which is that there aren't enough eligible black men to go around, in the sense that many black men have been jailed or over incarceration or racist policing or something like that has caused the black men to be severely undersupplied. What's your response to that?
I mean, I don't think you can discount the issues of incarceration um, in the marriageability question. Um, I'm sure that there's that plays a part. Now the thing is, I doubt that the type of man, again, regardless of race, who's serving 10 to 20 years for armed robbery is going to be marrying a woman who just finished law school, right? Put aside all the good girls like bad boys type of stuff. Generally speaking, that's not the pairing you see. Um, so it's possible that could affect the marriage market, particularly in lower income or working class communities. But as I said, I think a lot of it. I tend to be somebody who looks at culture before I look at policy. Um, Policy is important, right? Because through policy, the government can create incentives for certain types of behavior, economic incentives, right? Um, if, for instance, if the government through different public benefit programs makes it so that a person would receive more government support um, than they would earn if they worked, a minimum wage job, then that's an incentive to not work a minimum wage job, right? It's a financial, an economic incentive. So, so while I think policy is important, I always go to culture. I always ask myself, okay, what are the norms? What are the beliefs? What are the behaviors? And I think I want to make this point crystal clear because I think it gets lost a lot. When I say culture, I, that's what I mean. I don't. To me, culture is the set of um, values, beliefs, behaviors, norms um, that are prevalent within a particular group, however that's defined. A group could be a company, it could be a professional sports team, it could be a community, it could be a family, it could be an ethnic group, it could be a nationality. Um, but those things are prevalent. And it's important to say prevalent instead of inherent because things that are inherent can't be changed. Things that are prevalent can be changed. At one point, smoking in public or smoking indoors, smoking on planes was prevalent. But through a number of changes, some in the media, some in law, some in policy, um, you almost never see people smoking indoors now, right? So culture can be changed. So I think it's important to note that. And as I said, I think
But
Mhm.
it's also important, I would say, to note how policy drives culture too, though, because you mentioned LBJ's Great Society, and you mentioned the intense welfare system that basically replaced the black male. Is that what you're arguing in terms of caretaking of the family, in terms of a black woman's ability to live by, by herself and
Correct.
take care of
I
kids?
do think that that certainly was a factor. Yes,
Now, first of all, is that a bad thing?
is what a bad thing. Government support.
Is the re- is the government support of black women, to bear
Mhm.
bear children, is that a bad thing?
So I think I'll answer it this way, right? Sometimes you often hear people talk about um, welfare in its general sense, right? So the government providing, you know, cash transfers or direct support to low income either individuals or families, right? You hear it referred to as a safety net, and I do think societies should have safety nets for when people fall through all the cracks. So if a person is, cannot provide for themselves, um, if their family and friends cannot help, if their community cannot help, if other social, cultural or religious institutions cannot help, then I think having that safety net from the government is a good thing. But there comes a point where your safety net turns into a spider web, right? Now, the material may look the same, but if you go from saying, and again, this is regardless of color or race or ethnicity, but if this is the fourth generation that has to depend on the government for as its primary source of economic support, then you're no longer in a safety net situation, right? So um, I think to the extent that some of those programs incentivize or ended up creating multi generational poverty within particular families, I think that's a bad thing. I also think that, um, and this is what I'm about to say now is motivated more so by my faith as a Christian, right? One one of the first things I remember, me and my friends, we were in Sunday school, and one of the our Sunday school teacher, was a friend of, our families were all close, so one of the things he drilled into our heads is that any man that doesn't take care of his family is worse than an unbeliever. He would say infidel, and we would get a good kick out of it because that was like a line from a Batman series that was going on when we were kids. So, so to the extent that the government stepping in and becoming larger makes fathers smaller or creates incentives for them to abandon their responsibilities, that's definitely a bad thing. And again, that that is not specific to one group. And the government, generally speaking, um, as I said, safety net is one thing, but the government is a very unfaithful husband and an absent father because it just has too many households to support. So I would much rather see, and for me, whether I'm talking about the Black community, America in general, um, we need strong families.
Yeah.
They are the bedrock of any civil society. And again, when I think biblically, before God created an order of a priesthood or kings or prophets or judges or magistrates or civil government, he created a family. So I'm a big believer in that. And that's why I was drawn to Black and Married with Kids. And I think that is the most important social issue in this country today. And again, it goes cuts across all groups. And until we have leaders, whether in politics or in culture, who are willing to stand up and say that, a lot of things are going to fall through the cracks. Because I tend to think, um, you mentioned before, I sort of studied as an engineer, so I tend to think about things sometimes, social issues in an analytical fashion, and I think about that.
Yeah. I thought you were about to say
Oh, no,
social
no, 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 no,
engineering. I
no,
was like, uh-oh.
no. So I think about sort of like the if I could borrow from the law of conservation of energy, right? It says energy is neither created nor destroyed, but just transferred from one body to the next. Responsibility is like that too, right? So once it's created, it's never destroyed. If I abandon my family, somebody else has to pick up the slack. And whether it's my wife or my family or her friends or somebody else or finally the government, somebody's going to pick up the slack. But the difference is with responsibility, in a social sense, whenever that responsibility gets passed down, it almost always loses some of its power because nobody is more invested in the well-being of my kids than me and my wife. And if you expect a bureaucrat to care about your family more than you do, then you're gonna be in trouble. So that's why, again, if we're talking a safety net, a family falls on hard times, they need a little help to get back on their feet after they have exhausted other resources. Okay, I'm with you. But if you're saying this is the norm in particular communities, then I think you're talking about a totally different situation.
I think what you're definitely trying to say here that I definitely agree with is that there is a sense of responsibility in our culture today that is being lost. And by the way, that extends beyond so-called Black Americans. I mean, part of the reason why I made this podcast, Inconvenient Minority, is to show how the common perceptions about race that we have in our culture today are often misguided. And people say, "Oh, the Black family is in declining. What's wrong with Black people?" That's not. I mean, the same problems that are happening with the Black community are happening in lots of other communities right now, are happening with rural whites, are happening, with irreligious or less religious and people who are not as invested in community and everything like that. I think with Asian Americans, it hasn't really hit yet. Um, I think that there are also cultural factors as to why Asian Americans are able to stay married for longer. In some cases, especially people in the Chinese American community. But you know, these are problems that extend beyond race that kind of go directly and tie directly into what are we preaching as
Mm,
a culture via
right.
policy, via media, everything like that. You know, um, and and I think what you're trying to say here is that there is a hierarchy of responsibility that has sort of been abandoned. That is it is supposed to be first and foremost the father is supposed to be primarily responsible for the child, And, in some cases, when the father dies or is in combat or is incapacitated somehow, other people in the community pick up slack. But it's just a given that other people in the community are not going to be as strongly invested as a single father in the child and the child's well-being. And then if you don't even have that community, then the government picks up the slack, or in the case of LBJ, it actually takes up the entirety
Mm-hmm.
of the slack. And the government is the least concerned
Correct.
about the
Correct.
child's welfare. It's just a statistic. So that's the part being abandoned by all of this policy and
Yeah.
media culture.
Yeah. I totally agree, and I think, as you said, it's you see some of these changes across the board, and I think um, to the extent that you know there are leaders who are willing to step up and address some of these issues directly, um, in love, right? It's not about bashing people or ridiculing their decisions, but I think I it's rare to even hear, particularly an elected official, talk about the importance of marriage in the context of the well-being of children, or sort of the more general flourishing of society. So you'll hear it more from Republicans. You almost never hear it from Democrats. One of the last people who actually did it, ironically enough, was President Obama. And he did it on a number of occasions. He did it when he was a candidate, and he did it a couple of times as president. I always appreciated it when he did it, but his progressive supporters always criticized him, because when he did, they took it as he was trying to appeal to, you know, white conservatives by talking about marriage, and they accused him of, you know, perpetuating a respectability politics. And I always thought that was a very odd um, criticism of him. So I mean, it's to me, if you don't have strong families, you're not going to have a strong community. Point blank. Period. And nothing else that I see in terms of the byproducts of the decay of the family in America surprises me. Nothing. Um, there are numerous studies that tie, you know, family structure to educational outcomes for kids, economic outcomes for families, certainly children and the decisions that they make as it relates to relationships, marriage, and family down the line. So it's critically important, and I think um, you know we need people who are willing to step up and talk about it. So
Yeah, well, I mean, even you talking about Obama is pretty interesting. I actually wrote an article about Obama's telling of young black men to, embrace marriage, to embrace, you know, carving out a productive future for yourself and for your kids. I mean, Obama said, I mean, this is directly from the article that I wrote. I actually just pulled it up in 2019. He actually spoke at a forum directed at young black kids. He said, if you're very confident about your sexuality, you don't have to have
yeah, I remember that.
eight women
Hmm.
around you
Hmm.
twerking, you know? Then he said, the, um, he talked about, look, unless you look like Zion Williamson, the odds of being in the NBA are very low. The odds of being a doctor or a lawyer much higher, you know. And obviously there are elite athletes, and that is a path and avenue to success for people. But for the vast, vast majority of people, that simply just is not the case. You're just not genetically
Right,
qualified to
that's
do
true.
it. And so then you got to figure out an alternative future for yourself. Um, you know, but the issue I think is the same issue that you brought up, which is, you know, Obama was very well positioned as president of the United States with the biggest microphone in the world to talk directly about these issues of fatherhood and the black family, and why children without fathers are at a fourfold greater risk of poverty, why they're 7 times more likely to become pregnant as a teen, and everything like that. And that's all true. But but he definitely did not emphasize that enough. In fact, he continued the policies that were done by his progressive predecessors and that are continuing to be harmful
Well,
today.
I don't know. I think he used his bully pulpit to talk about the importance of it. As I said, the fact that he got criticized by his left flank told me that the message was getting through. Um, could he have discussed it more? Sure, but I don't think the type of changes that we need are not going to come from one president. Now, to be fair, it's hard to address any problem if you don't talk about it and address it directly, right? But that's one thing I actually will give him credit for, because he talked about it, he brought it up, and he brought it up specifically in the context of um, the strength and stability of Black communities, and I appreciate that. And I want to make a distinction, and because I want to drive this point home. When he brought it up, he would often talk about marriage and fatherhood. A lot of times, what you get, what I've noticed, is that a lot of people will talk about fatherhood, and that is important, right? But I think combining the two can help. My hope is that by talking about the two in combination, it can sort of bring some more energy to that broader conversation. Because what we did, 100 years ago, even 50 years ago, marriage and children, it was a buffet. You paid one price, and it all came together. Now it's more a la carte, right? Yeah, we like each other. We'll have kids. Not sure about marriage. And you see this a lot with millennials. This is particularly the case among younger generations. So anybody basically under 35, this is not abnormal to them. But so you have, and I saw an NPR article a number of years ago where it talked about couples and, as I said, millennials who are increasingly deciding to have children together, like an active decision, but saying that they're unsure about marriage. And I think the people that they interviewed, and this couple was actually white, it was like a younger, working class white couple. They said, you know what, we really want to have kids, but we're not sure we can afford to get married. And I'm not sure they said they're not sure whether, I don't think they said they're not sure they don't want to be together, but it was more so about affording to get married. And I thought um, that was an interesting and honest sort of piece of feedback from them. But as I said, I like discussing those issues together, and I know, so I think it makes a lot of politicians and cultural leaders squeamish, because it feels like you're being judgmental. It feels like you are talking down to people who have children, out of wedlock. And I think there's a way to discuss these things without doing that. So, for instance, I'll give an example, right? If you go to a lot of schools across the country and a lot of urban school districts, they will have banners and flags up on the wall with all different types of schools: Harvard and Yale and Duke and Stanford and Howard and Hampton University and Fisk and, you know, Texas A&M, and all throughout the school. But those schools know that every student is not going to go to college, right? But still, they see the encouraging every student to go to college as part of their mission. There's no reason, and their parents accept it too. Even parents who didn't go to college, right? They expect the school to encourage their children in that way. But for whatever reason, if someone with a public platform was to encourage young men and young women, hey, you know, education is great, job is great, but you know, marry first, then have kids, and have a bunch if you want to. Children are blessings, so on and so on and so forth. Basically, what um, I, I first saw the report from the American Enterprise Institute, what they call the success sequence, right? So you finish high school, some post-secondary college is great, but not necessary. But you finish school, you get a job, you get married, then you have children. And the report showed that on the couples who did that cross race, by the time they get into their 30s, their mid 30s, the poverty rate for those couples is in the single digits. So, um, so I think we need to change the way we approach that issue because, as I said, to me, any plan for progress in any community, and again, specifically in the African American community, that does not involve a plan for the family is not one that I see as being successful in the long term for in general. Now, middle class folks across races, the ones who are married, the ones who can afford private school, their kids are going to be fine, right? But as
Yeah.
I said, among working class and
Well,
well,
in today's
that's true.
educational
That's true.
climate.
You're
But
right, Kenny.
yeah.
Um, but generally speaking, they have the resources to weather the storm a little bit better, right? But
Yeah.
I'm talking about marriage having disappeared in entire communities all across this country where, um, it's a thing in the past. 100, or even 75 years ago, a guy could work at the plant, have a high school diploma, and he was at 25, he'd still be married and supporting, two kids. Nowadays, that reality is just um, not nearly as common as it used to be.
It's so interesting that you brought up an article where a young couple says we were going to make a decision to have a child, but we can't afford to get married. Isn't it supposed to be the opposite? Isn't the expense having children? Like the expense isn't getting married. I mean, unless you have a big flashy wedding or
Correct.
something like that. Marriage is actually supposed to help you, right? Because it's supposed to be able to allow you can save money, you can live under one income, you can go through life together. You have a notion of commitment. The wife can support the husband in their career and boost his career prospects. I mean, the whole purpose, I mean, there's a big economic, I think, savings from getting married. It's children are definitely an expense, but if for some reason they were looking at it the opposite way, it's
Yeah, and
fascinating.
and and the article is from 2014. I didn't understand it then. I still don't understand it 7 years later. But um, for women, and it says for women without a college degree, like the woman who's in the article, 55% of births are outside of marriage. For those with at least a 4-year degree, it's just 9%, and I'm sure that 55% number has gone up. But yeah, the quote from her is, "I don't want to be in my mid 30s having kids, but I can be in my mid 30s getting married, and it makes no real difference." So that was, that was her perspective. But yeah, I don't understand the logic. Um, but as I said, as is the case with cultural trends, once things set in and become more normal, once the social penalties for doing those things become lower and lower, um, and sort of less punitive, right? Then you start to see some of that behavior. So in my generation, if a man and a woman live together before marriage, they call it shacking up, right? That's what we call it. Nowadays, it's called we've been dating for 3 months because that's what people do. And particularly if they're living in an expensive city, they date for a couple of months, and the next step in the relationship is let's move in together. Not to say it didn't happen before, but there was a certain social penalty that was attached to that behavior that no longer exists now. Probably outside the most sort of culturally conservative or religious communities or families. Other than that, it's totally normal to see that type of thing. And I think what we're talking about in terms of marriage and children is very similar in that respect.
What previously allowed the working class in America to succeed had a lot to do with the fact that they stayed married. And, marriage in its best form is actually a big economic boon. Like, it really helps economically, not to mention all of the related social benefits that come across there. Um, but that's my concern about what's happening with the working classes today, is that they're losing a lot of those values,
Yeah, yeah,
religious community.
yeah,
Aside, I don't know best how to fix that, but that's part of the reason, why I'm talking with you. And I think you have a really good perspective on that.
yeah. I mean, I'm with you. I don't know how to fix it. I don't know that it can be fixed. I know that it won't get better if no one talks about it, right? So there are all types of causes, social causes, political causes, economic, interests that people talk about on a regular basis. But for some reason, the state of the American family is one that, people feel, hey, it's too personal. We can't get into that. But yeah, I agree with you. That this is a big issue, and I don't care who the community is, where it is, where it's located, what people do, what they look like. If the family is weak, if there's dysfunction there, if a guy is trying to support four kids by three mothers, and he's doing that, and trying to do his best to put food on all their tables, and especially if he lives on his own, so he's supporting five households. That's tough. That's tough, and a lot of times people talk about it from an economic perspective, but I tend to think about it even from the perspective from a social and emotional well-being perspective for the child. Right? There's certain things that, as a dad, um, of course, the provision is important. It's the sort of thing. My default, I tend to think about that, but there are times when, um, like with my oldest when she was young, if she wasn't feeling good and she sat up in the middle of the night and yelled out, "Dad!" Right? I'm glad I was there to respond. But if I live on my own and I had three kids, you know, and and all three were in either different parts of town, or some may live out of state. When my kid sits up in the middle of the night and calls out for me, and this assumes we have a relationship, right? I'm not there to answer, and I think about those things just as much as I do, you know, putting food on the table, because at the end of the day, um, kids need both parents, and our society, for whatever reason, has either explicitly or implicitly told men, you're basically the appendix of the family. If you have one, cool, but if you don't have one, you won't die, right? It's not completely necessary, and I reject that. Kids need both of their parents. They get something from mom just as well as they get from dad, and I think it's one thing, again, if circumstances prevent a father from being there for whatever reason, but that's different than saying we accept as a norm the um, you know men not being there or taking responsibility for their children, right? It's like you buy a car, you go to the dealership, you expect when you buy a brand new car, it's going to have four factory tires, right? You may drive off the lot, get into an accident, blow a tire out, and have to grab a spare from the back. But no sane person would go to a dealership and buy a brand new car that had a spare on it, because the spare is only there in case of emergencies. But when you um, sort of coming back to the social, cultural analysis, when you take something that should only be there in case of emergency, and now you say this is the new norm, then you shouldn't be surprised when you have trouble. Could you imagine driving from DC to California on a spare tire? I couldn't. And in the same way, I'm not surprised when, kids, and particularly in certain in communities where, fathers are not present or not involved, or not involved in the ways in which they want to be involved or could be or should be involved. I'm not surprised when, you know, certain outcomes come from that. And again, that's, across the country, across different ethnic groups. That's a more general sort of foundational point.
Does your wife agree with you on all this?
That's a good question. Um, we certainly see eye to eye on a lot of these issues. Even though we grew up in different parts of the country, we have very similar upbringings. Um, so, and I'm
Were you both raised in two-parent
yes,
families?
yes, we were. Um, so yeah, her parents were married, before her dad passed away. They were married over 50 years. Um, so, it, and that does shape how you see relationships, right? I had a friend one time that I think he was engaged to a woman, and I think she might have got cold feet because she saw her parents go through a divorce, and I think the pressure of trying to do something that she'd never seen done successfully really got to her. So they ended up, breaking up, and they both went this, own separate way. But it, it was probably less than a month before the wedding. Um, so that's the other part of it, right? What, kids, what you see in your household, again, oftentimes becomes the norm. And if the norm is you see, um, an entire family where no one is married, and even the ones who are married are not married for particularly long, and their relationships don't look particularly healthy, you're setting, a very, um, difficult precedent for your kids. But by God's grace, there are plenty of people who grew up in, family situations that were not ideal, and who've come to, you know want better and do better for their own families. And we mentioned, former President Obama, and he's certainly a person who will fit into that category. So it can be done. I just would prefer. I'd love to, in 30 years, see if we can bend the arc back a little bit in terms of, um, marriage and family in this country, because I think my hope is that, um, if we had stronger families, some of the other issues that we wrestle with may start to, recede a little bit. That's my hope. Yeah,
Do you do you see a movement towards bringing back, especially among Black Americans, bringing back ideals of family and marriage and
that's a good
everything like that?
question. I think, um, I've seen I benefit, again, through my relationship with Black and married with kids, from seeing what that could look like. So I mentioned the couple started a site. They released a number of documentaries, on marriage and family and child rearing and spouses who work together, on blended families, all types of documentaries. But they also did 4 marriage cruises. So, it'd be 50, 60 couples on a cruise. So it was a cruise. So, we would stop in different places. And then, but on the days where we were on the ship, um, there would be seminars on communication, on finance, as I said, on blended families, on entrepreneurship and working together. And those were some of the best experiences of my life, because you got to see couples. There was one couple from New York. I think they had been married 47 years. And the older, the husband almost served as like a sage, a wise man, an elder for some of the younger guys, because, they were the oldest couple. They've been married the longest. One of the cruises, there's a couple who's married like 7 months, right? So you had everything in between. And it was a really great example of what community can look like, um, and how people can support one another in their marriages, in their family, dealing with issues around, you know, kids and finances and all different types of issues. So I, I'd love to say that that was the norm. Unfortunately, in a lot of what I see, particularly in, you know, mainstream sort of popular culture, when I think about some of the sites and the blogs who market to, black readership or black audience, I don't see that type of emphasis on marriage and family. What I see is an emphasis on any issue that they can define as structural or systemic. So what I see is a lot of articles on what white supremacy is doing to the black community, right? Why we need to end white supremacy for black people to be free. Why um, this systemic racism is why, there are income differences between blacks and whites. I see a lot of that. Um, I don't see a lot of here's what I'll give you a perfect example, right? I wrote an article. It was actually my first article for the Federalist, and it was called something along the lines of, conversations about black people who need to stop focusing on white people, something to that effect. And one of the uh, towards the end of the article, I highlighted, at the time it was the NAACP partnered with a bunch of Hollywood actors, and the actors created a video that said that they take responsibility for racism, right? So these are all actors and actresses. So, it was over the top acting. It was black and white and sort of slow, somber music. And they were saying, I take responsibility for racism. And I, I asked myself, this is the NAACP. I mean, this is a venerable organization that has been behind landmark Supreme Court cases, you know, legislation and public policy. I mean, this is a serious organization. And yet they put their political capital, their moral force behind convincing white Hollywood stars to take responsibility for racism. Now,
Yeah.
what they should have done is said, you know what? As I said, we're going to promote the success sequence. And when we speak to our black audiences about, issues in our communities, we want to hammer that every chance we get. But I think they are representative of a lot of black institutions and organizations whose focus is primarily on what white Americans think, say, feel, and do, towards black folk, and not.
Why?
I think because um, one, again, the NAACP is a type of organization. They've been around for a long time, and what white people thought about black people really used to be important, right? So if you couldn't get a job, if you couldn't drink from a water fountain, if you couldn't, um, or if someone did something to you and you and a jury of your peers, quote unquote, would always let your offender walk free, those things are really important, right? So I'm not dismissing their work, and I'm not saying that addressing systemic racism has not been important in terms of the progress for black people. So if you don't have full voting rights, if you can't buy a house where you want, if you can't go to school where you want, if you can't marry who you want, you really are functioning in a version of second class citizenship. So again, I respect I respect the history, but anyone who argues that America in 2021 is the exact same country as America in 1921 is not being serious. So I think part of it is, institutional inertia. People get used to doing the same things. I think part of it is that that is the way. I think it's a lot easier for them to shine a spotlight on what they think white people are doing than it is for them to sort of you know, take the mirror to our own community and say, what are some of the things that we can do, that we can change? Um, I certainly think that after uh, the death of George Floyd last year, all of this stuff the knobs got turned up on all of these things to a 10. And I certainly think that, you know,
Yeah, every institution in
mhm,
America that had this uh what is it? Lurking substrate of um of advancing this racial narratives just suddenly came to life. It was the
yes,
trigger.
yeah. So I think that that's a part of it. And then the other thing, honestly, is just it's human nature. It's always easier to blame somebody else. And again, there was a time where we needed leaders who could say, "Look, the Constitution says that there should be equal protection under the law, and that's not a reality for a large swath of the country based on their skin color. So we need to rectify that." But if you're telling me today that the life outcomes of a black 8-year old in Philadelphia are more dependent on, you know, uh, Leonardo DiCaprio taking responsibility for racism than they are on the condition of his family, his community, and his school, then again, you're not. To me, I don't. I wouldn't consider that person. Anyone who would say that, I wouldn't consider them to be a serious person. Um, so yeah, I think, and then it pays. There were, I, I hate to say it this way, but very few people benefited from the death of George Floyd more than people who were in you know, the race business. So Robin DiAngelo, first and foremost. Then Ibram
Oh yeah.
Kendi, he sort of, you know, picked up some of
Oh
this,
yeah.
he
Got
right, he
some money
passed out at a
there.
certain point. But any institution or any organization that said that they were fighting systemic racism, I mean, Black Lives Matter certainly first and foremost among them, um, grabbed a lot of attention, and you know, I just it's a lot easier to do it that way, and then there's a market for it. To be completely frank, there are a lot of guilty white liberals who are there to open up their pocketbooks and say how sorry they are for their ancestors, even though some of them, their ancestors came from Europe in the 30s, and they don't all have roots in the old South. So I think it is a it, it's a symbiosis of um, whites and blacks who are both benefiting from keeping alive the notion that the biggest impediment to black Americans today is racism. And that's a notion that I do not agree with. Do I think that, do I think systemic racism is a thing? Yes, I do. Do I think that um, there are specific policies that are examples of that? Yes, I do. Do I think that it's the main thing holding back, um, you know, black people across the country? No, no, not even close.
Well, that's worth a whole nother podcast, Delano. I'm keeping you long here. Uh, so I'm just going to close with a couple of rapid fire
Sure.
questions,
Yep.
if that's
Sounds
cool
good.
with you. Should people get married?
Absolutely.
should you get married early?
If I had it to do over again, and I met my wife at 23, and I thought then the way I do now, I hope I would have married her at 23.
Should you have kids early,
Yes.
even if you're not making a high income?
Yes. I mean, people have done that for generations. My parents got married. My mom was 20, 21. My dad was like 24. They didn't have a lot
Mm-hmm.
of money. They made it work. So, you know, yeah, I think, to the extent possible, get married young, have your kids
Mm-hmm.
young. You all can grow up together. Um,
Hmm.
and I, as I said, I look at it from a biblical perspective, right? Children are a gift and a blessing. And I don't know anyone, whether religious or secular, who turns down any other
Mm-hmm.
blessing. If somebody says, "Hey, I'm
Hmm.
got a brand new car," cool, I'll take it. Raise, great. A new house,
Yeah.
cool. Hey, I'm gonna bless you with some kids. One boy, one girl, that's good enough for me. So no,
When you're dating somebody, how long should you wait until you should decide whether you should get engaged or not?
um
I know you
no,
didn't
I
wait
didn't
long.
I didn't wait long. I mean, I think um it's a difficult question to ask because I'm gonna answer it the way I would if my son asked me, right? My
Yeah.
kids are little, so this is not a conversation we're gonna have anytime soon. But
Yes. I'm your son,
okay.
Delano.
So I'll let you play my son in this instance. So I'd say, Kenny,
I'm the son that you had when you married your wife at 23 and had kids
got
early.
exactly. So I said, Kenny, um, one, when we talk about dating, we talk about courtship, right? So it's a relationship stage that has a particular goal in mind, right? And if you're courting somebody, I think within the first 2 months, 3 months, you should have a conversation about where this thing is going. Um,
Hmm.
I'm in favor of the man initiating that conversation. And if you all are on the same page, you know, and I'm fine with a guy and a girl having that conversation before they even start dating, so that they don't waste each other's time. But if that's the case, I you know I don't know, date for 6 7 months, get engaged, and get married shortly after that. I would not counsel people, young people, particularly young Christian couples, to have long, drawn out courtships and engagements. Um, I would not counsel anybody in that way. So yeah, I think the way my wife and I did it was perfect for us. We were a little older. We were about 30 when we met. Well, close to 30. We were 30 when we got married. Well, I was 30. She hadn't turned 30 yet. But that was perfect for us. The timing felt right. I wasn't about to be in a courtship for 6 years trying to figure out what I want to do with my life or with this relationship. So
Well, and lastly, what's the proper amount of facial hair to have?
as much as you can grow. Um, I it's funny, right? I when I started working at my job, when I started working at 25, like my career job, I had odd jobs between college and stuff. After college, I didn't have a single hair on my face, not one. I mean, smooth as a baby's bottom.
Well,
And now I've got a face full of facial hair, and I think if I told my wife I was going to cut it, she'd ask me, "Did Kenny convince you to do this? Because this is not it's not anything that we talked about." But yeah, I mean, every guy has a different style. It's cool. I didn't envision myself being a bearded guy, but now that I have it, I like it. It works for me. But it's one of those things where different guys make different decisions. But if you can grow a beard, I I know of very few instances where a guy looks worse with a full beard. I'll say it that way.
All right, Delano. Well, I'll take that in mind, even though my hair grows at a rate of a millimeter a month. So we'll see what we can do.
Okay.
But thank you so much for appearing on the podcast, Delano. This
Thank
was a
you.
great conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. Hope we can
Yeah,
do it again.
absolutely. Let's do it again.